The heavy mahogany doors of the courthouse didn't just open. They seemed to surrender as Damon stepped through, radiating the kind of authority that only comes from decades of getting exactly what he wanted. His tailored navy suit was crisp, and his polished shoes hammered a rhythmic, predatory beat against the marble floor. He didn't look like a man heading into a divorce. He looked like a CEO arriving for a hostile takeover. Leaning into his lawyer, Damon let out a sharp, confident chuckle that filled the hallway. "This is a formality," he muttered, his sharp facial features set in a permanent smug smirk. "By noon, she'll be lucky if I let her keep the clothes she's wearing. She has no idea how easy this is going to be." He adjusted his tie, his posture relaxed and dominant, already savoring the victory he believed was guaranteed. To the spectators in the corridor, he was a man who held every card in the deck. A man about to erase 40 years of marriage with a single, ruthless stroke. What Damon failed to notice in his rush to claim the throne was the woman already seated at the mahogany table inside courtroom B. Wilma sat with a spine of pure steel, her silver-gray hair perfectly coiffed, catching the harsh fluorescent light of the room. She wore a simple dark blue cardigan, a modest choice that Damon had always mocked as invisible. But today, it felt like armor. While Damon played to the crowd, Wilma's focus was singular. Wilma's hands, resting lightly on the mahogany table, were steady. There was no tremor of the nervous exhaustion Damon's legal team had cited in their latest motion. Instead, there was the calm precision of a master architect watching the final beam of a trap fall into place. She had spent the better part of her life being the fawn, the peacekeeper who anticipated Damon's moods like a sailor anticipates a storm. She knew exactly how many seconds it took for his ego to turn into a weapon and exactly which smiles would disarm him. For years, she had used that knowledge to survive. Now, she was using it to win. Damon's voice drifted in from the corridor, booming and brassy, the sound of a man who believed the world was his audience. Wilma didn't turn her head. She focused on the grain of the wood beneath her fingers. She thought about the inheritance he believed she had squandered, the one he had graciously managed into the ground while secretly diverting the funds. He thought she was a victim of her own frailty, a silver-haired relic of a marriage he had outgrown. He didn't know about the late-night sessions with a forensic accountant who worked out of a nondescript office in the suburbs. He didn't know about the encrypted files hidden in a cloud drive he didn't even have the password for. Most of all, he didn't know that the fragile woman sitting in the blue cardigan had memorized every offshore account number he'd ever whispered into a late-night phone call. A subtle, almost invisible shift occurred in her expression as the heavy doors finally swung open. The watery sheen in her eyes wasn't from grief. It was the clarity of a lioness who had been pushed into a corner and found she liked the view from the shadows. As Damon marched toward his side of the aisle, radiating the scent of expensive cologne and unearned victory, Wilma finally looked up. Her gaze was level, devoid of the fear he expected to find there. She was no longer his wife, his shadow, or his victim. She was the architect of his impending ruin, and for the first time in 40 years, she was the only person in the room who knew exactly what was about to happen. The transition from the sterile, brightly lit courtroom back to the hazy memories of 40 years ago felt like a plunge into cold water. In the beginning, Wilma remembered the way Damon had looked at her, not as a target but as a prize. He had been a man of grand gestures and even grander promises. When they first married, his overbearing nature had been disguised as a fierce, protective love. "Don't worry about the bills, Wilma," he would say, sliding a glass of wine toward her and gently taking the mail from her hands. "I'll handle the bank. You just focus on being beautiful." At 25, it had felt like a relief, a soft place to land. She hadn't realized then that by handing him the mail, she was handing him the keys to her autonomy. As the years bled into decades, that protection began to thicken, hardening into the bars of a cage she hadn't noticed was being built around her. The grand gestures became a means of isolation. When she wanted to take a part-time job at the local library, Damon hadn't forbidden it, he was too smart for that. Instead, he had laughed, a patronizing, melodic sound that made her feel small. Why would my wife want to dusty her hands for pennies? It's embarrassing, darling. People will think I can't provide for you. He made her desire for independence feel like an insult to his masculinity, a betrayal of the life he had gifted her. Slowly, the world outside their front door began to shrink until it was only as large as Damon allowed it to be. The abuse was never loud. It didn't leave bruises that a doctor could see. It was a war of attrition fought in the quiet moments between dinner and bed. It was the way he would sigh when she spoke her opinion on politics, a weary sound that implied she was far too simple to understand the complexities of the world. It was the way he managed her inheritance from her grandmother, moving the money into accounts she couldn't access for her own safety, telling her she was too emotional to handle such a large sum. He became the gatekeeper of her reality, the sole narrator of her worth. He told her she was forgetful until she began to doubt her own memory. He told her she was fragile until she was afraid to walk alone. By their 20th anniversary, the transformation was complete. Wilma had become the perfect corporate wife, a silent, elegant statue at his side who smiled when prompted and disappeared when ignored. She had learned to read the tightening of his jaw like a weather vane, adjusting her entire personality to keep the peace. She became a master of the fawn, the survival instinct that turned her into a mirror of his needs. But deep beneath the cardigan and the practiced smiles, a small, cold ember of the woman she used to be remained. She watched him thrive on his arrogance, building a multi-billion-dollar empire on the back of the confidence he stole from her every morning at the breakfast table. He thought he had broken her spirit entirely, but in his vanity, he had simply taught her how to wait. He had spent 40 years teaching her that silence was her only role, never suspecting that in that very silence, she was finally learning how to listen for his mistakes. The shift from psychological cage to tactical warfare began on a Tuesday, a day as unremarkable as the thousands that had preceded it. Damon was in Dubai, or perhaps it was Singapore. The locations had become interchangeable backdrops for his self-importance. Wilma had been tasked with organizing his study, a room she usually avoided, as it felt like the very heart of his dominion. It was a space of heavy mahogany and the scent of expensive cigars, where every book and paper was an extension of his ego. She had been moving a stack of old architectural journals when her foot caught the edge of a floorboard near the built-in safe. It didn't sit flush. It gave a hollow, metallic click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. Curiosity, a feeling she had long suppressed in favor of obedience, flickered to life. She knelt, her joints protesting, and pried the board loose. Beneath it lay a small, leather-bound ledger, black, battered, and entirely separate from the digital spreadsheets their family accountants managed. When she opened it, she expected to find perhaps a secret hobby or a list of private contacts. Instead, she found her grandmother's handwriting. Tucked between the pages were the original documents of Wilma's family trust. The inheritance Damon had assured her was being preserved for their sunset years. As she turned the pages, the protection Damon had provided for 4 decades dissolved. The ledger was a meticulous record of a systematic heist. In Damon's sharp, aggressive script, he had logged every withdrawal he had made from her trust over the last 10 years. He hadn't been preserving her future. He had been using it as a private slush fund to cover the mounting debts of his failing vanity projects. The billionaire lifestyle he paraded in front of the world was a house of cards built with her family's legacy. He had stolen millions, funneling the money through shell companies with names like L-Protect and W Security. A sick, private joke at her expense, mocking the very vulnerability he had created in her. The betrayal hit her with a physical weight, forcing the air from her lungs. It wasn't just the money. It was the realization that while he was telling her she was too emotionally fragile to understand finance, he was actively counting on that fragility to keep her from looking at the books. He had weaponized her trust and used her love as a blindfold. For a moment, the old Wilma, the one who wanted to apologize for even finding the book, threatened to take over. She felt the urge to put it back, to pretend she hadn't seen the truth, to maintain the peaceful illusion of her cage. But then, she looked at a specific entry dated 6 months prior. Damon had withdrawn a massive sum to purchase a consulting fee for a young woman whose name Wilma didn't recognize, all while telling Wilma that they needed to tighten their belts and cancel her long-planned trip to see her sister. The cold ember in her chest finally caught fire. The first crack in her submission wasn't a loud explosion. It was a quiet, crystalline shattering of her illusions. She didn't put the ledger back. Instead, she walked to the kitchen, took a high-resolution photo of every single page with her phone, and then carefully replaced the floorboard. When she stood up, the fawn was gone. The woman who had spent 40 years being protected realized that the only person who had ever truly needed protection was the man who thought he owned her. She wasn't just his wife anymore. She was his most dangerous creditor. The following months became a masterclass in the very invisibility Damon had forced upon her. Wilma realized that her greatest weapon was his own arrogance. He was so convinced of her fragility that he would never suspect her of strength. To keep him blind, she stepped deeper into the role of the submissive, fading wife. She practiced the art of the performance every morning, ensuring her hands shook just enough when she poured his coffee, letting her gaze linger on the floor whenever he raised his voice. She became the perfect victim, a woman seemingly so broken by his shadow that she was no longer a threat. While Damon spent his evenings preening over his supposed genius and meeting with the young consultants he thought were his secret, Wilma was living a double life. In the quiet hours when he was at the office or traveling, she transformed. She traded her soft-spoken persona for a clinical, cold-blooded efficiency. She began documenting every interaction, every dismissal, and every financial inconsistency. She found a specialist attorney who understood the nuances of silver splitters and elder financial abuse, meeting her in nondescript diners and public libraries where Damon's social circle would never venture. She learned to hide her tracks with the precision of a ghost. When she used the home computer, she did so through an encrypted browser she had taught herself to use via late-night tutorials. When she made phone calls to her private investigator, she did so from a prepaid burner phone hidden inside a hollowed-out box of vintage sewing supplies, a hobby Damon had long ago dismissed as quaint and useless. He would walk past her while she sat by the window, needle in hand, never imagining that the rhythmic movement of her stitching was a countdown to his own downfall. The hardest part of the performance was the emotional toll of remaining silent while he insulted her intelligence. There were nights when he would sit across from her at dinner and mock her forgetfulness, intentionally moving her car keys or hiding her reading glasses just to watch her struggle. In the past, this gaslighting would have sent her into a spiral of self-doubt. Now it was merely data. She would offer him a watery, confused smile and apologize for her failing mind, all while mentally logging the date and time of the psychological manipulation. She let him believe he was winning every skirmish. When he demanded she sign a restructuring document for their shared assets, she didn't argue. She simply asked him to explain it to her slowly, feigning a lack of comprehension that made him puff out his chest in superior frustration. He signed the papers for her, believing he was stripping her of her rights, unaware that she had already contacted the notary to report the coercion. By playing the part of the woman he had spent 40 years creating, Wilma ensured that when the final blow came, he would never see it coming. She wasn't just surviving his abuse anymore. She was curating it, turning every act of his cruelty into a permanent record that would eventually set her free. The hunt for the ghost of her past led Wilma to a cramped, dust-moted office in a part of the city Damon wouldn't visit even if his life depended on it. For weeks, she had been obsessed with a single hazy memory from their 3rd anniversary. A night when Damon had been celebratory, drunk on his first major land deal and unusually generous. He had presented her with a gift, a legal amendment to their marriage contract that he claimed would simplify their estate. In his arrogance, he had intended for the document to strip her of future alimony, but Wilma remembered a specific, handwritten clause her father had insisted upon before his passing. A reversionary interest that returned all commingled assets to the original bloodline if financial fraud was ever proven. Damon had laughed it off 30 years ago, confident he would never be caught, and eventually, the document had vanished from their home safe. Wilma knew he had likely destroyed his copy, believing the only other record was lost in the digital migration of the 90s. But she remembered the man who had witnessed it, Arthur Penhaligon, a notary public with a penchant for fountain pens and an obsession with physical archives. Finding Arthur was like trying to track a shadow through a forest. He had retired long ago, his firm swallowed by a corporate conglomerate that cared little for paper ledgers. It took 3 visits to the county archives and a series of accidental meetings with former clerks before Wilma found him living above an antique bookstore. When she climbed the narrow stairs, her heart hammered against her ribs, the old fear of Damon's discovery whispering in her ear. She was a woman in her late 60s, playing detective in the dark, but the moment Arthur opened the door, the fear receded. He was nearly 90 now, his eyes clouded by cataracts but his mind as sharp as a tack. When Wilma explained who she was, a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "The Lopez contract," he wheezed, leading her into a back room filled with floor-to-ceiling filing cabinets. "Your husband was very insistent that I use his preferred forms. But your father, he was a man who understood the value of a backup." Arthur hadn't just kept the record. He had kept the original handwritten notes. As he pulled a yellowed, scent-of-cedar folder from a bottom drawer, Wilma felt a surge of cold triumph. There it was, the forgotten clause. It was written in her father's steady, old-fashioned script and initialed by a younger, cockier Damon. The clause stated that any attempt to conceal marital assets or misappropriate trust funds would trigger an immediate and total forfeiture of his claim to their shared properties. "He tried to buy these from me 10 years ago," Arthur whispered, his shaky hand tracing the seal. "Sent a young man in a sharp suit with a check that had too many zeros. I told him the files were lost in a basement flood. I didn't like the look in that boy's eyes. He looked like a man who thought everything had a price." Wilma felt a lump form in her throat. While she had been living in a cage, world-weary and convinced of her own helplessness, these pages had been sitting in the dark, waiting for her. She didn't just need "I need time to think," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to satisfy his ego. "Time is a luxury you've already squandered," Damon snapped, checking his gold watch. He straightened his tie, the smug smirk returning to his features. He looked like a man who had already seen the final score of a game he was still playing. "Sleep on it if you must," But remember, when those doors open tomorrow morning, the offer is off the table. You can either leave as my wife with a modest stipend and your health intact, or you can leave as a public cautionary tale. The choice is yours." He turned on his heel and strode toward his bedroom, the floorboards creaking under the weight of his unearned confidence. He didn't look back. He didn't see Wilma set her embroidery aside and stand up with a spine that was perfectly straight. He didn't see her walk to her hidden burner phone and send a single-word text to her legal team. Proceed. As the house fell into a heavy, artificial silence, Wilma looked out at the city lights. Damon thought he was the one delivering an ultimatum, unaware that his $0 settlement was already a dead document. While he slept the deep, peaceful sleep of the arrogant, the gears of the countersuit she had filed in secret were already grinding into motion. The night before wasn't the end of her life as he had intended. It was the final night she would ever have to pretend that his shadow was larger than her light. Tomorrow, the storm wouldn't just be outside the windows. It would be waiting for him in courtroom B. The heavy mahogany doors of courtroom be settled into their frames with a final, echoing thud, sealing the world away. Damon sat at the petitioner's table, leaning back with his arms crossed, the expensive fabric of his suit bunching at the shoulders. He didn't just look confident. He looked bored, as if the destruction of a 40-year marriage was a minor administrative task he was eager to finish. Every few seconds, he would cast a sideways glance at Wilma, his sharp features twisting into that familiar, overbearing smirk, the one that had silenced her at dinner parties and dismissed her at breakfast for decades. Across the aisle, Wilma remained a statue of quiet composure. She looked down at the table, her silver hair catching the morning light, her hands folded over a simple leather folder. To the spectators in the gallery, she appeared to be the very image of the fragile woman Damon had described in his depositions. She looked small, silver, and defenseless. The proceedings began with a clinical coldness. Damon's lead attorney, a man with a voice like sharpened flint, stood up and adjusted his glasses. He didn't lead with financial figures or property disputes. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and produced a thick document bound in blue cardstock. He held it up like a trophy before approaching the judge's bench. "Your Honor," the attorney began, his tone dripping with a rehearsed, oily sympathy. "Before we discuss the division of assets, we must address a more pressing and tragic matter. We have here a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation and medical report regarding my client's wife, Wilma Lopez. It is the professional opinion of several leading specialists that Mrs. Lopez is suffering from advanced cognitive decline. Specifically, early-onset dementia exacerbated by chronic anxiety." A collective gasp rippled through the small audience. One person leaned forward intensely, their eyes darting between the two tables. Damon didn't turn around. He kept his eyes fixed on the judge, his smirk widening just a fraction. This was his scorched earth strategy in motion. If Wilma was mentally incompetent, her testimony was void, her claims to the trust were irrelevant, and he would be appointed as her legal conservator. He wasn't just trying to divorce her, he was trying to own her legacy. The report details several instances of confusion, memory loss, and a total inability to manage her own affairs. The lawyer continued, his voice echoing through the silent room. "My client has spent years quietly protecting his wife from the consequences of her failing mind. It is with a heavy heart that he asks the court to invalidate any recent legal filings she may have attempted, and to grant him full control over the marital estate to ensure she receives the care she so desperately needs." The words were a direct echo of the threats Damon had whispered in the rain-streaked living room the night before. It was a masterpiece of falsification, built on the foundations of the gaslighting he had practiced for 40 years. He watched Wilma, waiting for the break. Waiting for her to burst into tears or cry out in confusion, which would only prove the lawyer's point. But Wilma didn't break. She didn't even look up. She sat in her dark blue cardigan, her shoulders slightly tense but her face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of the lie hang in the air until it felt heavy enough to choke. Damon's smirk faltered for a heartbeat as he realized she wasn't reacting the way she was supposed to. He had spent 40 years training her to be afraid, but as the judge began to leaf through the falsified report, Wilma finally raised her head. Her eyes were clear, focused, and entirely devoid of the confusion the report described. She looked directly at Damon, not with anger, but with a chillingly clinical curiosity, as if she were watching a predator walk blindly into a pit. The smirk on Damon's face didn't disappear yet, but for the first time in the history of their marriage, the power in the room didn't belong to the man in the expensive suit. It belonged to the woman who had spent the last year documented every single lie he was currently telling. The judge's eyes remained fixed on the blue-bound medical report, his brow furrowed as he prepared to address the grave allegations of Wilma's mental incompetence. The silence in the room was brittle, a thin sheet of ice that Damon was certain would hold his weight. He leaned back further, the smug expression on his face deepening as he glanced at his lawyer, an unspoken signal that the killing blow had been landed. But the ice shattered when Wilma's attorney, a woman who had remained as silent and unassuming as her client until this moment, stood up. She didn't reach for a medical counter-report or a list of character witnesses. Instead, she produced a digital tablet and a single yellowed envelope that bore the unmistakable wax seal of a 30-year-old notary. "Your Honor." The attorney's voice was calm, cutting through the predatory tension of the room like a blade. "Before the court considers a report commissioned and paid for by the petitioner, a report we will later prove was authored by a doctor currently under investigation for ethics violations, we would like to present the court with a different kind of evidence. Evidence of a long-term, systematic financial fraud that renders the petitioner's claims not only moot, but criminal." Damon's smirk didn't vanish, but it froze. He watched as the attorney projected a series of bank statements onto the courtroom screens. They weren't the sanitized spreadsheets he had spent years showing Wilma. They were the raw, unedited logs from the offshore shell companies he thought were invisible. The consulting fees, the diverted trust funds, and the secret ledger entries Wilma had photographed months ago were laid bare for the court to see. "What you are seeing, Your Honor, is the DNA of a heist," the lawyer continued. "Mr. Lopez has been systematically draining his wife's family inheritance to cover the catastrophic losses of his private ventures. He didn't want a divorce, he wanted a cover-up. He attempted to have his wife declared incompetent because she is the only person alive who can testify to his embezzlement." A murmur of genuine shock erupted from the gallery. Damon's lawyer scrambled to his feet, shouting about unauthenticated digital records, but Wilma's attorney simply held up the yellowed envelope. "This," she said, her voice rising with a quiet power, "is the original 1996 amendment to the Lopez marriage contract. It was witnessed and notarized by Arthur Penhaligon, who is prepared to testify to its authenticity. It contains a reversionary interest clause, initialed by Mr. Lopez himself. It states quite clearly that in the event of documented financial fraud or the misappropriation of bloodline trusts, the petitioner forfeits all rights to marital assets, including his interest in the firm." The color drained from Damon's face so quickly it was as if a plug had been pulled. The sharp, authoritative features that had dominated Wilma's life for 40 years suddenly looked haggard, the ego behind them collapsing in real time. He turned to look at Wilma, his mouth hanging open, searching for the confused woman he had brought to court to destroy. Instead, he found the woman who had signed those papers first. Wilma sat perfectly still, her hands no longer hiding beneath the table. She looked at him with the cold, detached gaze of a victor. She had known he would try to claim she was crazy. She had known he would try to steal her dignity. And so, she had let him believe he was winning right up until the moment she pulled the final string. "My client isn't the one suffering from a lack of clarity, Your Honor," her lawyer concluded, sliding the original physical document onto the judge's bench. "She is the only person in this room who saw the truth clearly enough to document it for 30 years. She signed her Declaration of Independence decades ago. We are simply here today to collect the interest." Damon slumped into his chair, the heavy mahogany table suddenly feeling like a sinking ship. He had spent his life thinking he was the one playing the game, never realizing that the woman he had dismissed as an accessory was the one who had written the rules. Wilma didn't need to say a word. The paper trail spoke for her. A scream of justice that had been muffled for 40 years, finally allowed to roar. The silence that followed the judge's gavel was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air out of Damon's lungs. He remained slumped in his chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the yellowed pages of the 1996 amendment. The king of a paper kingdom had been dethroned not by a rival billionaire or a market crash, but by the quiet woman who had spent 40 years pouring his coffee and smoothing his pillows. The realization of his total financial ruin didn't hit him all at once. It arrived in waves of cold, jagged truth. Every property, every offshore account, and the very firm that bore his name were sliding through his fingers like sand, reclaimed by the forgotten clause he had so arrogantly initialed in his youth. Damon looked up, his face a gray mask of disbelief, his eyes searching for his legal team. But his high-priced attorneys were already closing their briefcases, their professional masks of loyalty slipping to reveal the cold indifference of men who knew their client could no longer pay their fees. The scorched earth he had intended for Wilma had backfired, leaving him standing in the center of the charred remains of his own life. He tried to speak, to muster one last booming command, but his voice failed him, coming out as a dry, pathetic rasp that didn't even reach the bench. Wilma stood up slowly, the movement fluid and unburdened. She didn't look at the spectators who were whispering in the gallery, nor did she linger to watch Damon's final collapse. She tucked her leather folder under her arm. Her shoulders relaxed for the first time in 4 decades. The tension that had lived in the small of her back since their wedding day had simply evaporated, replaced by a weightless, humming clarity. As she walked past Damon's table, she didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The sight of him, small, broken, and stripped of the power he had used to terrorize her, was enough. He was no longer a monster. He was just a man who had forgotten that every cage has a key. The heavy mahogany doors swung open one last time, but they didn't bang against the marble walls. They yielded to her touch. Wilma stepped out of courtroom B and into the grand corridor, her heels clicking a steady, confident rhythm that echoed through the hall. She walked past the security guards and the legal staff, her head held high, the silver gray of her hair shining under the light. She was no longer a victim, no longer a fawn, and no longer invisible. As she pushed through the final set of glass doors and stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the afternoon sun hit her face with a warmth that felt like a benediction. The air was crisp, smelling of rain and the city's restless energy. But to Wilma, it tasted like absolute, unfiltered freedom. She paused at the top of the stairs, closing her eyes for a long, deep moment. She drew in a breath that reached all the way to her soul. A breath that wasn't stolen, wasn't sanctioned, and wasn't afraid. Down in the plaza, The world continued its frantic pace, but Wilma stayed still, savoring the quiet victory of the survivor. She thought of the $0 settlement Damon had tried to force upon her the night before and felt a soft, genuine smile touch her lips. She had walked into that building as a woman with a secret, and she was walking out as a woman with a life. 40 years of silence had finally ended, and as she stepped down toward the sidewalk, blending into the crowd of 1,000 other free souls, Wilma realized that the greatest treasure she had reclaimed wasn't the money or the estate. It was herself. She was finally, irrevocably her own.